They say the cruelest fate is not dying once, but waking up with the memory of how everyone watched you fall. Adeline Hart had learned that truth beneath the towering stone arches of the royal court, where every noble lowered their eyes as though silence could wash away guilt. She had stood there wearing nothing more than the faded blue-gray servant's dress she had scrubbed and mended with her own hands, her long brown blonde hair stirred gently by the cold breeze drifting through the open windows. She searched the faces around her for someone, anyone, willing to speak for her. No one did. At the top of the marble steps sat Alpha King Damien Ashford, his black royal armor catching the pale morning light, his crimson cloak spilling over the throne like flowing velvet, his long dark hair framing a face carved with impossible strength. The king who had once unknowingly become the center of every hopeful dream she had ever dared to keep never looked away, yet somehow never truly saw her. His wolf remained silent. His judgment remained unchanged. Adeline closed her eyes as sorrow settled over her heart, not because she feared what came next, but because she realized the only life she had ever wanted would end without the truth being heard. Her final thought was not anger. It was regret that kindness alone had never been enough to change destiny. Then everything disappeared. Darkness swallowed every sound until even her heartbeat seemed to fade into endless silence. Moments later, a gasp escaped her lips. Warm air filled her lungs. The scent of fresh linen, polished wood, and lavender surrounded her. She opened her eyes so quickly that the unfamiliar brightness forced her to blink. Sunlight streamed through a narrow servant's window instead of the gray skies she remembered. Her hands trembled as she stared at them. No bruises. No scars. No trembling from exhaustion. She turned toward the small mirror hanging beside the door and nearly forgot how to breathe. The frightened young woman staring back looked several years younger. Hope still lingered inside those green eyes. She touched her own face, then stepped backward until the edge of the bed caught her knees. "This room," she whispered before freezing. The words had escaped naturally, yet the room answered only with quiet. It was the tiny servant's chamber she had been assigned on her first morning inside the royal palace. The realization struck harder than any nightmare. She was not dreaming. She had returned to the beginning. A loud bell echoed through the palace corridors. Once. Twice. 3 times. She remembered that sound perfectly. It announced the arrival of newly hired servants before they received their assignments. The same morning. The same hour. The same chance she had once believed would lead to a better future. Tears gathered in her eyes, but she brushed them away before they could fall. No. She had cried enough in another lifetime. This life would not belong to grief. She would not spend years quietly admiring a king who never knew her heart. She would not place blind faith in smiling nobles. She would never again stand alone before a court that mistook innocence for betrayal. Pulling a steady breath into her lungs, Adeline opened the wooden door and stepped into the corridor. Servants hurried past carrying baskets, uniforms, and ledgers exactly as she remembered. Every detail matched the memories that still haunted her. Somewhere beyond those stone walls, Alpha King Damien Ashford was returning victorious from the northern frontier, unaware that the servant destined to die before his throne had just rewritten fate with a single heartbeat. And although Adeline walked away from the royal audience hall without looking back, somewhere deep inside the palace, a powerful wolf stirred from restless sleep and lifted its head toward a scent it had somehow missed before. Adeline kept her head lowered as the stream of servants moved through the eastern corridor, but every step echoed with memories no one else carried. The polished stone beneath her shoes had once felt like the beginning of a dream. Now it felt like the first page of a warning she had already lived. Voices bounced through the hallway as supervisors assigned new arrivals to kitchens, laundry rooms, guest quarters, and the royal residence. She remembered exactly where she had stood before, exactly which steward had smiled kindly before later testifying against her, and exactly which hallway she had taken that eventually led her into the king's path. Fate had once unfolded through 1,000 ordinary choices. This time, she intended to change the very first one. Adeline Hart, the senior steward called. She stepped forward calmly. "The royal residence requires another servant." A familiar sentence. The same words that had shaped her previous life. Every eye turned toward her. Serving inside the king's residence was considered an honor, even for an Omega. In another life she would have accepted without hesitation, believing hard work and quiet loyalty could build a future. Instead, she lifted her chin just enough to meet the steward's eyes. "Sir, if it pleases the palace, I respectfully request assignment to the royal library." The corridor became unusually quiet. Several servants exchanged puzzled glances. No one refused a position near the Alpha King. The steward frowned. "The library is lonely work. Dust, records, forgotten scrolls. Why would you choose that?" Adeline offered a gentle smile that revealed nothing. "Books do not judge servants by their birth." The answer drew a few soft laughs, but the steward simply studied her for a long moment before marking a change beside her name. "Very well. The library has needed another pair of careful hands." Relief spread quietly through Adeline's chest. One choice had changed. One thread had been cut before it could tighten into the rope that once pulled her toward tragedy. Hours later she climbed the winding staircase leading to the oldest wing of the palace. The royal library stood beneath a vaulted ceiling painted with silver wolves running beneath a full moon. Shelves stretched farther than she remembered, carrying histories, treaties, forgotten bloodlines, and legends most nobles dismissed as fairy tales. The scent of aged parchment surrounded her, strangely comforting after the fear that had followed her through 2 lifetimes. An elderly librarian named Miriam welcomed her with a warm smile that Adeline did not remember meeting before. "Books have long memories," the woman said while placing a ring of bronze keys into Adeline's hand. "Sometimes they remember truths that people choose to forget." The words settled deep inside Adeline's heart. As she dusted forgotten shelves, she discovered an old genealogy ledger bound in faded blue leather. She reached to straighten it, but the instant her fingertips brushed its cover, a strange warmth pulsed beneath her skin. For only a heartbeat, the silver wolf embossed on the binding seemed almost alive. She pulled her hand back immediately. The warmth vanished, leaving only unanswered questions. She carefully returned the volume to its place without opening it. Somewhere else in the palace, Alpha King Damien Ashford had just entered the throne room after weeks away at war. Ministers greeted him with reports of trade, border disputes, and court ceremonies, yet his attention drifted unexpectedly toward the eastern wing. An unfamiliar scent floated through the open windows, faint as spring rain after a long winter. His wolf lifted its head inside him with unusual urgency. "Find her." Damien frowned. There was no reason those words should exist inside his thoughts. He ignored them and continued listening to the council, but the feeling refused to fade. It lingered like the memory of someone whose name had been forgotten while the heart still refused to let go. High above the quiet library, Adeline paused beside a narrow stained glass window overlooking the palace gardens. She had changed the first step of destiny. Yet as sunlight spilled across the colorful glass, a distant howl echoed somewhere no ordinary ears could have heard, and every instinct inside her whispered the same impossible truth. Fate had noticed she was no longer walking the path it had prepared. Sleep brought Adeline no peace. The moment she closed her eyes, winter returned. Snow drifted across silent palace steps, and she watched herself standing before the royal court once again, her faded servant's dress fluttering in the freezing wind. She searched the faces surrounding her until her eyes found Damien upon the throne. Only this time something was different. Before the memory could reach its familiar ending, his expression changed. His eyes widened with unmistakable panic, as though he had suddenly realized something precious was slipping beyond his reach. He rose from the throne and reached toward her, but an invisible distance stretched between them no matter how desperately he tried to cross it. Then a deep howl rolled across the frozen sky, shattering the dream like fragile glass. Adeline woke before dawn, her heart racing. She pressed a trembling hand against her chest, confused by the unfamiliar image. That had never happened before. In her first life, the Alpha King had remained distant until the very end. Why would her memories begin changing now? She dressed quietly and returned to the royal library while the palace still slept beneath pale morning light. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunshine as she unlocked the heavy oak doors with the bronze keys Miriam had entrusted to her. The silence usually comforted her, yet today it felt as though thousands of forgotten voices waited patiently inside the ancient shelves. She began sorting returned volumes until her fingers brushed another weathered manuscript hidden behind a row of crumbling histories. Unlike the others, its leather cover carried no title, only the faint outline of a wolf encircled by a crown. The instant she touched it, warmth spread through her palm again. A whisper echoed inside her thoughts. Not with words, but with recognition. Home. Adeline pulled her hand away, breathing slowly until the strange sensation faded. She did not open the book. She was not ready to awaken secrets that had remained buried for generations. Meanwhile, across the palace, Damien Ashford stood before the tall windows of the royal council chamber while advisors debated taxes, harvests, and treaties. Their voices faded into meaningless noise as another dream lingered stubbornly in his mind. He had seen a young woman standing alone beneath falling snow. He had never seen her face clearly, yet grief clung to the memory with startling weight. His wolf paced restlessly beneath his calm exterior, refusing every attempt to settle. Find her. The command came again, stronger than before. Damien frowned. His wolf had never behaved this way. It had faced wars, rival alphas, and dangerous negotiations without losing control. Yet now an unknown scent drifting somewhere through the palace unsettled the ancient creature more deeply than any battlefield ever had. One of his commanders noticed the king's distraction. "Your Majesty, are you unwell?" Damien answered without taking his eyes from the gardens below. "Tell me, has anyone new entered palace service this week?" The commander looked surprised. "Several servants arrived after your campaign, sire. Mostly kitchen workers, stable hands, and librarians." Librarians. The word stirred something inexplicable inside him. A sharp ache settled beneath his ribs before disappearing just as quickly. He dismissed the feeling as exhaustion, but his wolf refused to believe it. Hours later, Adeline carried a stack of restored ledgers toward the upper gallery where the oldest royal blood records were stored. As she climbed the spiral staircase, she passed an elderly court historian examining faded family crests beneath a candle. Without warning, the old man looked directly into her eyes. His expression froze. The candle slipped slightly in his hand, though he caught it before it fell. For several long seconds he simply stared, as though searching through memories older than his own lifetime. Finally, he whispered almost to himself, "Impossible. Those eyes belonged to the first royal wolves." Before Adeline could ask what he meant, the historian turned away abruptly, gathered his scrolls with shaking hands, and hurried from the gallery. Alone once more, she touched her face in confusion while somewhere deep beneath the palace, hidden behind stone older than the kingdom itself, a forgotten chamber answered with the low, distant heartbeat of something that had been waiting many generations to awaken. Morning mist drifted through the palace gardens like silver silk, softening the ancient towers that had watched generations of kings rise and fall. Adeline carried a basket of restored manuscripts toward the Eastern Archive, hoping the quiet rhythm of ordinary work would silence the growing unease inside her. It did not. Since the old historian had recognized something impossible in her eyes. Every forgotten corner of the palace seemed to watch her in return. The whispers inside her dreams had begun following her into waking hours, never loud enough to understand, yet impossible to ignore. As she passed beneath an ivy-covered stone arch, an unfamiliar warmth spread across the back of her hand. She stopped instantly. Thin strands of silver light shimmered beneath her skin for the briefest heartbeat before disappearing again. She quickly pulled down her sleeve and looked around. No one appeared to have noticed. Even so, her pulse refused to slow. In her previous life nothing like this had ever happened. Whatever had changed when she returned had awakened something that destiny had once kept asleep. She hurried toward the library, but the strange warmth returned with every step, stronger than before, almost as though it were guiding her somewhere beyond her own understanding. Deep below the palace, hidden beneath layers of stone older than recorded history, another heartbeat answered hers. It was slow, powerful, and patient. Adeline reached the library doors and leaned against the heavy oak for a moment before unlocking them. Miriam looked up from a reading table and immediately frowned with gentle concern. Child, you look as though you have seen a ghost. Adeline forced a small smile. Only poor sleep. Miriam nodded kindly, yet her thoughtful eyes lingered on Adeline's face longer than usual. Then let work steady your heart. Ancient books have a way of reminding us that fear is never the whole story. Grateful for the distraction, Adeline climbed toward the restricted gallery where forgotten royal records rested beneath thick layers of dust. She carefully arranged several genealogies before pausing beside the untitled volume marked only with the crowned wolf. This time she did not touch it. Even standing nearby filled the quiet room with an almost invisible pressure. Suddenly footsteps echoed from the spiral staircase. Adeline stepped aside as three elderly royal elders entered the gallery to inspect historical records requested by the council. They spoke quietly among themselves until the oldest of them happened to glance toward her. His voice stopped in the middle of a sentence. The silver cane in his hand trembled ever so slightly. He stared directly into her eyes with unmistakable disbelief. Slowly, almost instinctively, he lowered his head. The other two elders followed his gaze, and although confusion crossed their faces, each of them also became strangely silent. For one impossible moment the oldest elder looked ready to kneel. Instead, he gripped his cane more tightly and whispered, "Forgive these old eyes." Without another word, the three men turned and left the gallery far more quickly than they had entered. Adeline remained frozen, unable to understand what had just happened. At that very moment, several floors below, Damien crossed the grand hall surrounded by knights and advisors discussing preparations for the upcoming royal assembly. He should have been listening. Instead, an overwhelming wave of restlessness swept through him so suddenly that he stopped walking. Every knight halted beside him. His wolf surged forward with unusual force. She is here. Damien closed his eyes briefly, disturbed by the certainty in that silent voice. He had never experienced such a pull towards someone he had never met. Before anyone could ask whether something was wrong, a faint sound echoed through the palace. It was not heard with ordinary ears but felt somewhere beneath the soul, like the distant call of an ancient wolf greeting the first light of dawn. Far above, hidden within the highest gallery of the royal library, Adeline placed a trembling hand against her chest as the same call answered from deep inside her own heart, and for the first time since awakening in her second life, she realized the power stirring within her was no longer waiting for permission to awaken. The palace had changed, although no one else seemed to notice it. The corridors remained polished, the banners still carried the crest of the royal wolves, and servants continued their daily routines with practiced precision, yet beneath the calm surface another current had begun to flow. Adeline felt it each time she crossed the ancient halls. Invisible eyes seemed to follow her, not with suspicion, but with quiet expectation, as though the palace itself remembered a name history had forgotten. She tried to ignore the feeling and devoted herself to restoring fragile manuscripts, believing ordinary work could keep extraordinary secrets hidden. But fate rarely accepted silence as an answer. Across the western gardens, Lady Vivian Blackwood watched the servants from the balcony outside her private chambers. She had spent years mastering the delicate balance of influence inside the royal court. Every smile had a purpose. Every conversation gathered information. Every favor created another debt. She had expected the Alpha King's return to strengthen her position even further. Instead, whispers had begun reaching her from unexpected places. Three respected elders had left the royal library visibly unsettled. An elderly historian had abruptly requested access to forgotten royal records. Even the palace guards quietly repeated strange stories of an unfamiliar presence that made seasoned wolves unusually restless. Vivian disliked mysteries she did not control. She summoned one of her trusted attendants. "Find the new library servant," she said softly. "Learn everything about her. Where she came from. Who speaks with her. What she does when no one is watching." The attendant bowed immediately before disappearing into the bustling corridors. Unaware of the order that had just been given, Adeline carefully organized a collection of weathered journals inside a secluded reading chamber. One volume slipped from the shelf and landed open across the stone floor. She bent to retrieve it, but her eyes caught a faded illustration before she could close the pages. It showed an ancient Luna standing before a gathering of wolves while a silver mark glowed above her heart. Behind her stood an enormous white wolf crowned with light instead of gold. Beneath the image, centuries-old handwriting had faded until only a single sentence remained legible. The royal wolf awakens only when the kingdom has forgotten its true guardian. Adeline's breath caught. Before she could read another word, footsteps echoed outside the chamber. She gently closed the book and returned it to the shelf just as Miriam entered carrying a small stack of records. "The council has requested additional family archives," the elderly librarian explained. "It seems the nobles have suddenly become interested in bloodlines." Adeline forced a calm smile, but unease settled deep inside her heart. That had never happened during her first life. The timeline was changing more quickly than she had expected. Elsewhere in the palace, Damien stood alone inside the Hall of Kings long after the council meeting had ended. Portraits of former rulers lined the walls, their painted eyes fixed upon generations that followed them. He stopped before the oldest portrait in the gallery, depicting the kingdom's founding Alpha and his Luna. Something about the woman's gentle expression stirred a memory that did not belong to him. For an instant he saw snow falling across silent marble steps and heard a quiet voice whisper his name with heartbreaking tenderness. The vision vanished before he could grasp it. His wolf growled softly within him, not in warning, but in grief. Damien pressed one hand against the cold stone pillar beside him, unsettled by emotions he could not explain. At that same moment, the attendant sent by Vivian quietly observed Adeline leaving the library with a basket of restored manuscripts. Hidden beneath the shadow of an archway, he watched as a narrow beam of afternoon sunlight touched her hand. For the briefest instant, delicate silver lines shimmered beneath her skin like living moonlight before disappearing again. His eyes widened in disbelief. Without waiting another second, he hurried back toward Vivian's chambers, carrying news that would convince the ambitious noblewoman that the quiet Omega servant was far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. By the time the autumn sun settled behind the western towers, the quiet rhythm of palace life had begun to fracture in ways only a handful of people could sense. Adeline felt it first in the silence. Servants who had once smiled warmly now hesitated before speaking. Courtiers lingering outside the royal library stopped their conversations whenever she approached. The invisible thread of fate had tightened again, but this time it did not pull her toward the same future. It twisted into something unknown. She reminded herself that fear had ruled her first life for far too long. If destiny intended to test her again, she would answer it with patience instead of panic. Even so, the memory of standing alone before the royal court refused to leave her heart. That evening Miriam handed her a sealed request bearing the royal crest. "These genealogical records must be delivered to the Hall of Records before sunrise," the elderly librarian said with a gentle smile. "The council has become unusually interested in forgotten family lines." Adeline accepted the bundle with steady hands, but inwardly her thoughts raced. In her previous life the council had never examined ancient bloodlines until years later. Someone had already begun searching for answers. Somewhere else inside the palace, Lady Vivian Blackwood listened calmly as her attendant described the silver light that had appeared beneath Adeline's skin. She asked no questions until every detail had been repeated twice. Only then did she dismiss the servant and walk slowly toward the tall windows overlooking the palace courtyard. Her expression remained perfectly composed, yet her mind moved with careful precision. An ordinary Omega could never display such a sign. If the rumors proved true, the quiet library servant represented more than a mystery. She represented uncertainty, and uncertainty threatened every plan Vivian had spent years constructing. If she cannot be understood, Vivian murmured softly to herself, then she must be watched. She decided not to accuse Adeline. Not yet. Information was always more valuable than haste. Meanwhile Damien Ashford found himself abandoning another council discussion before it had concluded. His advisors exchanged uneasy glances as the Alpha King walked alone through corridors that should have held no interest for a ruler burdened with affairs of an entire kingdom. Yet every instinct urged him eastward, toward the oldest wing of the palace. His wolf remained unusually alert, guiding him through unfamiliar hallways with quiet certainty. He finally stopped outside the carved oak doors of the royal library. 4. Several long moments he simply stood there, one hand resting lightly against the ancient wood. An unexpected sense of peace settled over him, followed immediately by sorrow so deep it stole his breath. Images flashed behind his eyes. Snow drifting across marble steps. A young woman lowering her gaze with heartbreaking dignity. A pair of green eyes filled not with anger, but disappointment. Damien opened his eyes sharply. The visions disappeared before he could understand them. Inside the library, Adeline paused in the middle of arranging a shelf. She had not heard footsteps, yet her heartbeat suddenly quickened as though another heartbeat had answered it from beyond the wall. An unfamiliar warmth spread across her chest, stronger than anything she had felt before. Without thinking, she turned toward the entrance. Neither of them opened the door. Only a few feet separated them, divided by nothing more than carved oak and years of forgotten truth. Damien slowly lifted his hand toward the handle, but before his fingers touched the brass, a sharp voice echoed from the far corridor. "Your Majesty, the Royal Council requires your presence immediately." The moment shattered. The strange pull faded just enough for duty to reclaim him. Damien lowered his hand and walked away, though every step felt unexpectedly heavy. Adeline waited until the silence returned before releasing the breath she had been holding. She could not explain why tears had gathered in her eyes when she had never even seen him. Hidden high above the library entrance, unnoticed by either of them, an ancient silver crest carved into the stone archway shimmered faintly for the first time in centuries before returning to stillness, as though the palace itself had quietly witnessed two destinies passing within arm's reach and knew that their next meeting would change far more than either of them could yet imagine. The summons to the royal assembly arrived before sunrise, carried through every corridor by messengers dressed in silver and black. Palace servants whispered that the council would announce new policies concerning the kingdom's oldest noble families, while the scholars quietly exchanged uneasy glances, knowing that ancient records had suddenly become more valuable than gold. Adeline stood beside the long library table, carefully wrapping the final collection of genealogies requested by the council. She had already memorized enough of the faded names to understand one troubling truth. Entire branches of the royal bloodline had vanished from official history without explanation. It was as though someone had erased them so completely that even their memory had become dangerous. Miriam noticed the concern in her eyes and gently placed a weathered hand over hers. "There are moments when history chooses someone to remember what others wish to forget," she said softly. "If that moment comes, do not let fear decide your path." Those words lingered with Adeline as she carried the records through the palace toward the grand hall. Every familiar hallway stirred another fragment of memory from the life she had already lived. She remembered walking these same corridors years later, frightened and alone, believing silence would protect her. Now she understood that silence had protected only the lies. Across the palace, Damien prepared for the assembly, though his thoughts remained hopelessly divided. His advisors discussed treaties and harvest forecasts while his attention drifted toward the eastern wing again and again. The strange dreams had become clearer with each passing night. He no longer saw only snow. He heard a gentle voice promising that even the coldest winter would someday welcome spring. The words filled him with an unbearable sense of loss, yet he could not remember ever hearing them before. His wolf paced restlessly beneath the calm mask of a king, refusing every attempt to settle. "Find her," it urged once more. "Do not lose her again." Again. That single word echoed inside Damien's mind long after the voice had faded. It made no sense, yet it carried the weight of absolute certainty. Meanwhile, Lady Vivian Blackwood watched the gathering nobles from an upper balcony. Reports continued arriving from her attendants, each one stranger than the last. Elders unsettled by a servant's presence. Ancient records reopened after decades of neglect. The Alpha King abandoning meetings to wander near the royal library. She had built her future upon predictability, and every unexpected change traced back to the same quiet Omega. Vivian smiled graciously as she greeted passing nobles, but behind that flawless composure another decision quietly formed. She would arrange for Adeline to appear before the council under the simplest possible reason. Curiosity, after all, often revealed far more than accusation. As the great bronze doors of the royal assembly opened, nobles, elders, scholars, and royal officers filled the magnificent chamber beneath towering stained glass windows that cast rivers of colored light across the polished marble floor. Adeline entered only to deliver the requested archives before returning to the library. She kept her eyes lowered, hoping to remain unnoticed. Yet as she crossed the center of the hall carrying the heavy records, sunlight poured through the highest window and settled gently upon her. A warm pulse spread across her chest. The silver lines beneath her skin shimmered once more, brighter than ever before. At the far end of the chamber, several elderly council members rose instinctively from their seats. One man's cane slipped from his trembling hand. Another stared at Adeline with tears gathering in his eyes, as though he had spent an entire lifetime waiting to witness something he believed impossible. Before anyone spoke, a deep, ancient howl echoed through the hall without coming from any visible wolf. Every conversation stopped. Every heartbeat seemed to pause. Damien turned toward the sound at the exact same instant Adeline lifted her eyes, and for the first time their gazes truly met beneath the silent ceiling of the royal court, while somewhere deep below the palace, an ancient seal hidden for centuries began to crack open with the quiet certainty of destiny awakening at last. No one moved. The silence inside the grand hall became so complete that even the banners hanging from the towering columns seemed to stand perfectly still. Damien Ashford could not look away from the young woman standing in the center of the chamber. The instant their eyes met, another fragment of a life he could not explain crashed into his thoughts. He saw snow drifting through the royal courtyard. He heard his own voice calling a name filled with desperation. Then he saw empty marble steps where someone precious should have been. The vision vanished before he could reach it, leaving behind only an ache that settled deep within his soul. His wolf surged forward with overwhelming certainty. She is the one. Do not let history repeat itself. Adeline felt the same invisible pull, but unlike Damien, she understood only enough to fear it. The bond stirring between them did not erase the memories of another lifetime. She still remembered believing that trust alone could protect her. She still remembered standing before this very court with no voice willing to defend her. She lowered her gaze, determined not to let old feelings decide her future again. Yet the warmth inside her chest continued to grow until delicate silver light shimmered beneath the fabric covering her heart. Gasps spread quietly among the gathered elders. The oldest council member stepped forward with trembling hands. His eyes remained fixed upon the faint glow surrounding Adeline. That light, he whispered. It has not appeared since the age of the first crown. Murmurs swept through the nobles. Some exchanged confused glances while others instinctively bowed their heads without fully understanding why. Lady Vivian watched everything from her place beside the royal advisors, but unlike the others, she hid every trace of surprise behind a perfectly composed smile. Inside, however, alarm spread through her carefully ordered plans. The servants she had questioned had spoken the truth. Whatever power rested inside the quiet Omega was awakening faster than anyone had predicted. She could no longer afford to observe from a distance. She needed answers before the court found them first. Before anyone could speak again, the bronze doors at the rear of the chamber opened and 3 elderly guardians entered wearing ceremonial robes embroidered with ancient silver wolves. Their order had not appeared in public ceremonies for decades. The nobles immediately fell silent as the eldest guardian slowly approached Adeline. Instead of questioning her, he carefully raised an old crystal pendant hanging from his neck. The clear stone remained colorless for one heartbeat. Then brilliant silver light flowed through it, filling the entire chamber with a soft radiance that reflected across polished marble and stained glass alike. The guardian closed his eyes as though listening to a distant voice carried by the wind. When he finally spoke, his words were calm, but they echoed through every corner of the hall. The palace has recognized what we refuse to remember. Adeline instinctively stepped backward. She had hidden from destiny since the moment she awakened in her second life. Now destiny had found her anyway. Deep beneath the palace, another powerful heartbeat answered the crystal's light. Ancient mechanisms sealed for generations quietly shifted into motion. Dust drifted from forgotten stone ceilings as hidden passageways slowly awakened. Damien descended from the royal platform without waiting for ceremony or permission. Each step toward Adeline felt strangely familiar, as though he had walked this path countless times before. He stopped several feet away, careful not to frighten her. Neither of them spoke. Words suddenly felt too small for everything neither of them understood. Then his wolf fell completely silent for the first time in days, not because it had lost its voice, but because it had finally found what it had been searching for. At that exact moment, a young royal messenger rushed breathlessly into the chamber carrying a weathered scroll marked with the forgotten seal of the first royal bloodline, and before anyone could stop him, he announced that workers restoring the oldest foundations beneath the palace had uncovered a hidden chamber containing records sealed by the kingdom's very first king. The forgotten scroll was carried into the center of the grand hall with a reverence reserved only for the oldest treasures of the kingdom. Every conversation faded as the eldest guardian accepted the weathered parchment with careful hands. Its silver seal, untouched for centuries, shimmered the moment Adeline stepped closer, as though the document had been waiting for her alone. A quiet murmur spread through the gathered nobles. Damien remained only a few feet away, unable to explain why every instinct urged him to stand beside the young woman whose presence had already begun changing the kingdom in ways no battle ever had. The guardian slowly broke the ancient seal and unfolded the brittle pages. Time seemed to hold its breath. Faded ink covered the parchment, yet the words remained remarkably clear. They spoke of a royal bloodline entrusted with protecting both crown and kingdom, a line that had willingly vanished from history during an age of betrayal so that its final heir might one day return when the realm needed unity more than power. At the bottom of the scroll rested the original crest of the first royal wolves, identical to the silver symbol that had begun appearing beneath Adeline's skin. The chamber fell completely silent. One by one, the oldest elders lowered their heads, not in obedience to a servant, but in respect for a legacy they had believed lost forever. Adeline could scarcely breathe. She had returned to this life determined only to avoid another tragedy. Never had she imagined that the strange warmth within her heart was not a curse, but the echo of an ancient promise carried through generations. Another memory surfaced from her previous life, clearer than any before. She remembered dusting the same forgotten shelves, passing the same untitled book, sensing the same quiet warmth without ever understanding its meaning. The signs had always been there. Only now had fate allowed her to see them. Damien closed his eyes as another wave of memories crashed through him. He saw himself standing alone in the empty court after losing someone whose face he had never been allowed to remember. He heard regret in his own voice, stronger than any command a king could ever give. Although the full truth still remained beyond his reach, one certainty settled deep inside him. Whatever destiny had hidden between them, he would not ignore it again. He stepped forward and, before the entire royal court, bowed his head in sincere respect toward Adeline. The simple gesture sent astonished whispers through the hall. A king did not offer such honor lightly. Lady Vivian watched the moment with perfect stillness, though disappointment flickered behind her composed smile. She understood that the balance of influence inside the palace had shifted forever. Open opposition would only isolate her. If she wished to preserve her place, she would need to adapt to a future she had never anticipated. The eldest guardian carefully rolled the ancient scroll closed before speaking with calm authority. History has returned to us not to divide this kingdom, but to remind us that true strength is measured by wisdom, humility, and compassion. His words echoed beneath the vaulted ceiling as sunlight streamed through the stained glass once again, surrounding Adeline with a gentle silver glow that no longer frightened her. She looked across the hall toward Damien. The pain of another lifetime still lived quietly within her, but it no longer controlled her future. This life belonged to choice rather than fear. As the bells of the palace began to ring across the kingdom, the hidden chamber beneath the ancient foundations opened completely, revealing countless forgotten records that would restore the truth of the royal bloodline to history at last, while everyone gathered in the grand hall realized they were witnessing not the end of one servant's story, but the beginning of a new era built upon remembrance, redemption, and the courage to choose a kinder path than the one the past had left behind.